morning and Womanjika. Welcome to our Reconciliation Week Assembly. Each assembly we start with an acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge, on behalf of the college, the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather from home today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present.
For Indigenous Australians, country doesn't just mean a place on the map. As Professor Mick Dodson explains, country is a word for all the values, places, resources, stories, and cultural obligations associated with an area. So when we say an acknowledgement of country, we are not only remembering that this land, before it was our school, had a very different custodian. We are also paying tribute to the rich heritage, history, and culture of the first Australians.
We acknowledge
the traditional owners
and custodians of this land. We acknowledge
the waterways,
the land, the sky, and all who
inhabit this place.
Country.
We acknowledge
Our ancestors.
We acknowledge
our elders
who have gone before us
and those who stand for us today.
We acknowledge our past
and stand here for our future country.
Reconciliation Week marks the anniversary of some important events in Australian history. The week officially begins on May 27th. The day today marks the anniversary of Australia's most successful referendum. In 1967, over 90% of Australians voted to give the Commonwealth power to make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and recognise them in the national consensus. This is a fantastic example of Australians working together for reconciliation.
The week ends on the 3rd of June, otherwise known as Mabo Day. Mabo Day marks the remarkable event in Australian history where Eddie Mabo was successful in his case against the Queensland Government. The result of this judgment established the concept of native title, which is the recognition that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have rights and interests to their land and waters according to their traditional law and customs as set in Australian law. Additionally, the classification of Australia as terra nullius, literally meaning a land belonging to no one, was overturned.
The theme of this year's National Reconciliation Week is more than words. Reconciliation takes action. Reconciliation means when two groups come together with a sense of friendship and mutual respect. It can also mean a return to friendly relations. But what does it mean to take action? We learn in the book of Proverbs that death and life are in the power of the tongue. Yes, words are important and they can greatly impact our relationships. But what are words when they are not backed up with action?
When it comes to reconciliation, we can learn and discuss, but this year we are being asked to look at how we can turn what we learn into action and to be a part of the change that our country needs. In today's assembly, we will be looking at people who have or continue to take action in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community as well as our own community. It is our hope that we will be able to learn from those who come before us, and we will continue to make a difference.
Our people have lived on country for more than 65,000 years. The reconciliation process drives us to work on the relationship between the first peoples of this continent and those who now call Australia home. At its heart, reconciliation is about what happens in the simplest of terms of where we live, where we learn, where we work and where we socialise. This year is 20 years of Reconciliation Australia. Our communities continue to grow, to learn about Australia's past and to help improve reconciliation. Now, we as a nation need to act to become a more just and equitable Australia. We need more people speaking up, speaking the truth, asking the hard questions, seeing the hard facts. 2021 is a year for us all to take action, to play our part. Reconciliation is more than a word. Reconciliation takes action.
Uncle William Cooper was an Indigenous activist who fought for the rights of Indigenous people through petitions to the Prime Minister and even the King of England. Born in 1860 on Yorta Yorta country, he moved to Maloga Mission, where he was noticed by the mission manager, Daniel Matthews, for his great aptitude for learning and knowledge. From there, he moved to the Kamarajunga Reserve and was taken under the wing of Thomas Shadrach James, who furthered his education, learning, and sparked his passion for fighting for Aboriginal rights and justice. In 1933, he established an organisation called the Australian Aborigines League, which aimed to better the life of Aboriginals and campaigned for social justice on behalf of all Aboriginal people, such as the petition to King George V in 1933 for Indigenous Australians to be represented in the Australian Parliament.
He also remarkably wrote a petition to protest the brutality of the Nazi regime and stood up for our people following the horrors of Kristallnacht in 1938. He wrote a petition against the persecution of the Jews and delivered it to the German consulate in the same year. We honour William Cooper's activism and determination to help those in his own community and even those in places far away. To be active is not just to help your own people, but to look out for those who are in need of help.
On the night of November 9th, 1938, Nazi soldiers looted and destroyed Jewish homes, businesses and synagogues throughout Germany. It became known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, and is seen by historians as the beginning of the Holocaust. A few weeks later, and 10,000 miles away, William Cooper, an Aboriginal from the Yorta Yorta people, led a protest through the streets of Melbourne to the German consulate to protest the cruel persecution of the Jewish people by the Nazi government of Germany.
Grandfather grew up in hard times. He knew how his people were treated and saw how they were treated. And when he saw something in the paper about Kristallnacht, he could see no one else was going to do anything about it. And he said to himself, well, I've got to do it. And he organised a march, mainly Aboriginal people. There were some white people with them, and marched on the German ambassador.
It was the only private protest to occur anywhere in the world.
In 2008, then Prime Minister signed the Closing the Gap Statement of Intent, which set the aim to close the gap between Indigenous Australians in many areas including education, life expectancy, and incarceration rates.
10 years ago, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people started the Close the Gap campaign. Governments agreed to 7 targets in health, education and employment. This year's Closing the Gap report showed mixed results. We're on track to meet targets for child mortality rates and Year 12 attainment. Progress for the reading and numeracy target was varied, and we must accelerate progress to meet the targets for life expectancy, early childhood education, school attendance and employment. We have seen some long-term encouraging gains. In health, a focus on a positive start to life has seen a decline in child mortality rates. In education, the number of Indigenous students in higher education award courses has increased by 70%. And in employment, outcomes are strong for Indigenous graduates, with the employment gap almost completely closed. In many cases, the numbers needed to close the gap are within our reach. Last year, in Year 3 reading, the target would have been met if an additional 640 Indigenous students met the minimum standards. And while we've seen the positive improvements, there is a need to accelerate progress to meet the targets that aren't on track.
Education is one of the keys when closing the gap. In 2019, it was found that at Year 10 level in the general population, approximately 90% of students attended school, but when looking at the same statistic for the Aboriginal community, it drops to under 70%.
Hayley Maguire, the co-founder and national coordinator of the National Indigenous Youth Education Coalition, was last year awarded the Women's Agenda Changemaker of the Year. In February 2019, she wrote a piece for The Guardian Australia describing failings of the education system for the Indigenous communities, stating, "When I think about my great-grandchildren, I envision a future where we can push beyond what is known and create a school that is founded on Indigenous pedagogies," she wrote. When thinking about taking action, Hayley Maguire has chosen to use the tool of education to ensure that the future is a better place for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people.
After hearing about some of these inspirational people, I can't help but think, where can I begin, and how can I take action to further reconciliation? The team at Reconciliation Week have put together a list of things that you can do to take action. Some year levels will be looking at this list in more detail tomorrow during Extended Bite.
Call out racism. Racism damages lives and livelihoods, whether in the city, regions, online, or in public spaces. Getting abused, ignored, refused services, or getting followed by security has long-lasting damaging effects. Check you understand how your unconscious bias and attitudes affect your thinking and actions. Be ready to call out racism when you hear or see it. Have those conversations with family and friends.
It's all about history. A key challenge in the reconciliation movement has been overturning the measure of historical events and the great Australian silence when it comes to Aboriginal history. When talking about the history or story of Australia, always include the participation and presence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Find out facts and ways to learn and talk about Australia's history.
Know your local history. Australia's history is marred by massacres and forced removals of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Investigate your local history and the record of colonial leaders who are memorialised by place names in your local area. If they are guilty of historical crimes against First Nations peoples, then start a community conversation about renaming these places.
Support self-determination. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples need to be in charge of decision-making and leadership for themselves and their communities. Understand the strengths in First Nation community control in governing, health, education, curricula, and media representation. Support and promote community-controlled and Indigenous-governed organisations.
Get your facts firsthand. Inaccurate portrayals, negative stereotypes, and under-investigation reporting on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues means if you want the whole story, you should start at the source. Inform yourself with First Nations produced and created content and news. Check out and follow NITV, Koori Mail, National Indigenous Times, Indigenous X, ABC Indigenous, and find your local broadcaster via First Nations media. Speak out against blatant racism and misinformation in mainstream media and reporting.
Care for country. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have stewarded, nurtured, and cared for Australia's diverse environment and waterways for over 80,000 years. Environmental knowledge and activism must prioritise First Nations' right to manage and self-determine their own country. Support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, systems of knowledge on our natural environment, including SeedMob, the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation, Fire Sticks Alliance, and Yarrabingan. Learn about how climate change is going to directly affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Stand up in support for those it's already affecting.
To keep with the theme of staying active, the Social Action Committee has compiled this list of resources to help all of us step up and show our allyship this Reconciliation Week. They are small steps you can take, like buying from businesses which support Indigenous Australians, or watching a movie or documentary to educate yourselves. But each small step counts in striving towards an equal and harmonious culture in Australia built on a foundation of understanding. Since the atrocities of the Stolen Generations from 1910 to 1969, where many First Nations children were forcibly removed from their families as a result of various government policies,
we reflect on the legacy of trauma and loss that continues to affect Indigenous communities today.
Statistics from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare in a study conducted in 2018 highlight that 1 in 7 Indigenous Australians aged 50 and over were removed from their families in their youth. This group is likely to have been charged by the police, been to jail, have felt discriminated against, and is less likely to own their home and be in good health. This demonstrates that the effect of the stolen generation is still detrimental to this day, and we cannot simply forget and move on. We are asking you to commit to actively partaking in actions, no matter how small they may seem, in order to help bridge this gap and acknowledge the damaging and ongoing effects of the stolen generation.
As a school, an opportunity to take action and immerse yourself in learning about Aboriginal culture is the Yorta Yorta Biyakad program, a series of workshops about Indigenous culture, history, and current affairs. It culminates in a study tour to Yorta Yorta Country, where we meet elders and visit sacred sites. 3 years after having had the privilege to participate in this program, I am still impacted deeply. All the speakers from the trip told me that education is the only way to move forward. Since then, I have continued to educate myself and the people around me.
An important takeaway from the program was that all of us in this room, all Australians, should assume the responsibility to educate ourselves so that we can understand the issues facing the First Peoples and learn how to combat stereotypes, because education paves the way to positive change. As a minority group, it is especially important and relevant for us at this school to learn about their place in this country's history and our country.
We are lucky to be students at a school that offer the incredible Yorta Yorta Biyakad program.
As future graduates of this school, we know it is our responsibility to be chazak ve'amatz, to be strong and of good courage in our actions and beliefs. Outside of the school, there are other ways to help and be involved with the Indigenous community and to help act towards closing the gap.
Stand Up has a special and enduring relationship with the Aboriginal communities of Tumla and Bogabilla. For over 15 years, Jewish Mob and these communities have built long-lasting friendships based on mutual respect, admiration, and a desire to learn and grow from each other.
Their relationship with Tumla and Bogabilla materializes through 3 unique programs: Derech Emetz, Camp Connections, and Young Adults. Each program has a set of unique objectives designed to engage and partner with young people in Tumla and Bogabilla and facilitate structured learning leadership, vocational and educational opportunities for people in the community, as well as fun and engaging games for younger members of the community during school holidays.
This opportunity is a way to continue to learn about and contribute to the Indigenous community as young Jews.
Mark Liebler AC is a preeminent tax lawyer with a deep commitment to social justice and reconciliation. For more than 30 years, his firm, Arnold Block Liebler, has provided legal advice to a range of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and maintains an unparalleled reputation for its support of Indigenous people and causes. Mr. Liebler served for more than a decade on the board of Reconciliation Australia and co-chaired both the expert panel and the referendum council that explored options for constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Along with all of this, as someone who has taken action to further reconciliation, Mr. Liebler is also an old collegian of Mount Scopus, and I have the great pleasure of introducing him to address us in honour of National Reconciliation Week.
While I'm really very sorry not to be with all of you in person, I'm still absolutely delighted to be taking part, at least virtually, in this special assembly to mark National Reconciliation Week. Rabbi Kennard asked me to speak about what motivated me to be as involved as I have been with Indigenous people and causes, which is something people often ask me about. So as a non-Indigenous Jewish tax lawyer, it's a fair question. But let me come to it in a few minutes. I want to start with some very basic historical facts about this country and the impact of European settlement on the population of people who occupied this land at the time and over a remarkable 60,000 years before. And while you listen, I want you to consider whether anything I say about the suffering and the injustice experienced by Indigenous Australians reminds you of what the Jewish people have endured. It's conservatively estimated that when the First Fleet arrived from Britain in 1788, there were at least 750,000 Indigenous people living on the continent. Their lands and waters were colonised without treaty or consent. Australia was declared terra nullius, a land that belongs to no one. Despite what many Australians of today like to tell themselves, there was significant resistance from the Indigenous population, and it's estimated that 3 out of 4 did not survive colonisation. By 1901, when 6 British colonies federated to become the Australian nation, the population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had been devastated by massacres, poisoning, imprisonment, and the forced removal of children. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were not given a voice in the debates that led to the drafting of the Australian Constitution, effectively our nation's birth certificate. As it turned out, the Constitution included 2 sections that specifically discriminated against Indigenous peoples. One clause stated that in calculating Australia's population via the national census, Aboriginal people would not be counted. And the other said that the Australian Parliament could make special laws for people of different races, but not for Aboriginal people. This left them at the mercy of diverse and discriminatory laws of the states and territories. Which brings me to some of the current issues faced by Indigenous Australians today. Issues that this nation and all of us must also face up to. When people experience trauma, the wounds can also affect their children, their grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. Now, this doesn't mean that current governments of Australia or current generations of non-Indigenous Australians are responsible for past wrongs. But we are responsible for recognising the impact of intergenerational trauma rather than blaming and shaming the victims of it. And we are responsible for supporting our Aboriginal fellow citizens to work through this trauma so that it doesn't negatively impact generations to come. And you know what? This means giving them the respect and support to identify and prioritise their own problems and to design and implement their own solutions. Now, while our approach has come a long way since the early days of Federation, when the so-called Aboriginal protectors had total control over the lives of Indigenous people, we still think we know best. So let me come back to my own reconciliation story. When I was a boy, growing up in Melbourne and attending Mount Scopus College, we didn't have the opportunity to attend assemblies like this one. In fact, we learned nothing about Australia's Indigenous history. I wasn't aware of having ever met an Aboriginal person, although I may have, until the 1990s, when my firm started to advise the Yorta Yorta peoples in their epic struggle for native title. By the way, they remain our clients 3 decades later, alongside many other Indigenous community organisations. It was around the time we took up the Yorta Yorta case that I heard the story of William Cooper, a great Yorta Yorta leader who devoted his life to fighting for the rights of his people and for all marginalised peoples. Today, his name is recognised more by Jewish Australians than the wider community. And the reason for that is the protest he led in December 1938 against the German government for its mistreatment of the Jewish people. As a child, William had been educated by a well-known Anglican priest called Daniel Matthews, who had encouraged Aboriginal students to identify with the Jews of the Bible as disempowered but unified peoples. And so it was that a month after Kristallnacht, a night of government-sponsored harassment and persecution by the Nazis against the Jewish population, William Cooper, aged 77, led a group of Aboriginal people nearly 10 kilometres across town from his home in Footscray, all the way to the German consulate. He carried a petition that all of them had signed, which read, and I quote, "On behalf of the Aboriginal inhabitants of Australia, we wish to have it registered and on record that we protest wholeheartedly at the cruel persecution of the Jewish people by the Nazi government in Germany. We plead that you would make it known to your government and its military leaders that this cruel persecution of their fellow citizens must be brought to an end." When Cooper and his fellow protesters arrived at the German consulate, they were refused entry. But the story of the stand he took on behalf of our people lives on because it was extraordinary and because it was inspirational. My sense of the ties between the Jewish community and Aboriginal people has grown even stronger through my friendship with Noel Pearson, a well-known Aboriginal lawyer. When Noel graduated from university, he came to work for me. And he said many times over the years that the time he spent at Arnold Bloch Liebler taught him how much our two peoples had in common. He described it in an essay he wrote back in 2004 and focused on three primary connections. The first connection was the importance both peoples placed on having a strong, unified community that doesn't stand in the way of individuals reaching their full potential. The second connection was that both peoples feel strongly about maintaining tradition and a land-based identity while continuing to engage in the wider world, despite the persecution we have suffered. And the third connection Noel wrote about was the strong sense of identity both peoples have, an identity that comes from never forgetting and always defending the truths of history, good and bad. Over the last few years, Noel Pearson and I have worked alongside one another in trying to progress the issue of recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Australian Constitution. We were members of a council, the Referendum Council, that engaged in the most extensive consultation process with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people ever undertaken in this country, to ask them how they wish to be recognised. That consultation culminated in a statement issued to the people of Australia in May 2017. It was called the Uluru Statement from the Heart. You may have heard about it. Essentially, what it calls for is the establishment of an advisory body which gives Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples the opportunity to influence laws and policies that affect their lives. Lives that, on average, remain poorer, sicker, harder and shorter than the lives of other Australians. It would only be an advisory body. It would have no power of veto over the Parliament. It would bear no resemblance whatsoever to a third chamber of Parliament. Sound fair? I was privileged to be at Uluru when the Statement from the Heart was endorsed, and I certainly thought so. But there is a way to go to convince some of our politicians. And of course, that's where you come in. If the Australian people, and particularly its young people, tell our political leaders how sensible and reasonable it is for Indigenous Australians, after all they have suffered, to be given a say in ending the intergenerational suffering, those leaders will have to listen. As the theme of this year's National Reconciliation Week states, and I know it to be true, more than a word, reconciliation takes action. Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, I join with all of you in thanking Mark Lieber for giving of his time to share his story. It is truly inspirational to hear from a person so eminent in their field of how they've given their time and their energy to help Indigenous Australians. I also want to thank everyone involved in today's assembly, and especially for their tremendous efforts in converting it into a virtual format at the last moment. The theme of this assembly is taking action to encourage reconciliation. And the first action that we all have to take, the first task, is to learn about the history of First Nation Australians, to learn about the suffering that they experienced at the time of the beginning of European settlement, and to learn about the continuing contribution that First Nation Australians make to our society, often from a position of great disadvantage. And after we have learnt, and while we are continuing to learn, we need to translate that knowledge into action. And there are many ways that we can support and advance reconciliation. By donating to charities that help Indigenous communities, by volunteering, by continuing to learn and continuing to share the stories of the First Nation Australians. And not to be a bystander, but to be an upstander when we're aware of discrimination or disparaging comments. And we're doing this not as saviours, not as people who come in to save the Indigenous communities, but as allies, to support them in their challenges, in their struggles for equality and for a better way of life. If we commit ourselves to learn and to act, then we can indeed increase what we call reconciliation, not just through this assembly, not just through this National Reconciliation Week, but throughout the rest of our lives. Thank you.
To conclude our assembly, a group of Yorta Yorta B'Yachad graduates would now like to share a special song. It is in Yorta Yorta language, but it is inspired by Exodus from the Torah, and it speaks of God's help in decimating Pharaoh's armies. The chorus, Nara Bura Phara, Yamana Yala Yala, translates into English as the Lord God drowned all Pharaoh's armies, hallelujah. The words are a symbol of freedom and are based on an ancient song in the Jewish tradition known as Miriam's Song, therefore establishing a connection between Jewish and Indigenous people.
One raka Moses yen wala yepun yepuch narabura fera yamanayala narabura fera yamanayala yala narabura fera yamanayala yala narabura fera yamana bura fera yamana narabura fera yamanayala yenuk beku jesu Rarobuka Yamana, Narabura Fera Yamanayala, Narabura Fera Yamanayala Yala, Narabura Fera Yamanayala Yala, Narabura Fera Yamana, Bura Fera Yamana, Narabura Fera Yamanayala, Narabura Fera Yamanayala Yala, Narabura Fera Yamanayala Yala, Narabura Fera